Hello, world. Welcome to PEPtalk. Conversations with people building a regenerative economy, discussions about impact, sustainable finance, and the stories shaping both. I'm Joe Baker.
And I'm Amira Alpha, and we lead Planet Earth Partners.
To get us started, here's a quick recap of the biggest headlines from the past few weeks. The World Bank dropped its flagship climate finance target after finally exceeding it. The Green Climate Fund unlocked nearly $6 billion without raising a single dollar. Quimbrook closed $784 million Clean Infrastructure Fund, and Catalyst Fund raised another $30 million for African climate startups. Congratulations to you both. Europe dramatically scaled back its ESRS sustainability reporting requirements. CDP sold a majority stake to private equity. ISO released a new independently verifiable net zero standard. Frontier committed another $915 million to carbon removal, and perhaps the most ironic headline of the week, at London Climate Week, a climate session focused on extreme heat was canceled because it was too hot.
What a busy week. And while those stories sound unrelated, I actually think they fall into four much bigger themes. One being public climate finance, the second is private capital, third would be corporate disclosures, and finally, reality catching up with policy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Let's start with the governments, because the World Bank and the Green Climate Fund almost tell opposite versions of the same story.
Yeah, exactly. The World Bank quietly retired its headline target of directing 45% of financing towards climate projects. But ironically, they did it the same year they finally actually exceeded it. Meanwhile, the Green Climate Fund went the total opposite direction. Instead of raising new money, they're just restructuring its balance sheet and instantly freed up almost 6 billion to deploy.
Hmm. So one institution is moving targets, and the other is squeezing more out of value from the money it already has.
Right. The common thread isn't climate ambition, it's constrained public funding. Governments are under pressure, donor countries aren't fulfilling commitments, and multilateral institutions are trying to adapt.
So while governments are tightening their belts, private investors don't seem to be.
Exactly. I mean, look at Quinbrook, nearly 800 million into mature renewable infrastructure, and then there's Catalyst. They put $30 million into some of Africa's earliest stage climate startups. Very different investments, same signal. Capital still wants climate. It's just becoming more selective.
Hmm. Infrastructure with predictable cash flows or venture-backed innovation solving real problems. The middle ground is getting squeezed. The third
Yeah, I
theme
would
is
say
one
so.
most people probably won't notice until they're the ones writing sustainability reports, regulation.
Yeah, exactly. I think what's happening right now is Europe is simplified, or they've simplified their reporting dramatically. Companies have fewer disclosure requirements, but at the same time, CDP has now moved into private ownership, which is alarming, I would say.
Hmm.
And
I'd have
ISO
to agree.
released a draft net zero standard that's independently verifiable. Those sound like separate stories, but they're actually all about the same question. How do we measure sustainability without overwhelming companies?
Yeah, it's definitely a fine line to walk, and I think we may be going too far, frankly, in the direction of complex accounting requirements, as opposed to generally just getting a sense of what direction you're going, and then focusing more time and effort on the impact work as opposed to the reporting side of things. But it's a balance we've been trying to strike for a while, and hopefully we're getting a little bit closer to a good medium ground. But as we move
Yeah.
into yeah.
No, I was going to say, I know that we've been talking about that for a while, Joe.
Most certainly, yeah. I mean, we've spent much of our careers, helping companies do exactly that. And one of the reasons for Planet Earth Partners is our I think philosophy that all of the good intentions as well as the thoughtful capital should really be directed much more towards the impact work and not the carbon accounting work, where we see a lot of corporate sustainability teams getting bogged down and those kind of overburdensome reporting requirements. And so, certainly a topic to dive deeper in on another date during our topic deep dives. But as we move through the headlines, going from kind of reporting and regulation, moving into the market itself, we have Frontier, another $1 billion almost committed to carbon renewal. Anthropic joining in, more standards, more verification, like we were just talking about. But it feels like the market's maturing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I would say that a few years ago, the conversation was, should we do this? And now it's, well, how do we finance it? How do we verify it? How do we scale it? That's actually a sign that the industry is growing up.
It is. It is. We're maybe in our teenage years now, and hopefully quickly maturing into adulthood when it comes to the sustainability industry. And it really is never too soon because nature is catching up with us and reminding us that there's a really meaningful urgency in the work that's being done. The headline that made me chuckle the most, but also made me worry the most, is that the panel on extreme heat at London Climate Week was actually canceled for that exact reason. Extreme heat.
Yeah, you couldn't even script it better.
No, no, no. Reality is stranger than fiction sometimes. That wraps up our headlines for the week. And, let's switch gears into our deep dive on e-waste and the next frontier of mining. When people hear mining, they picture giant trucks, open pits, maybe somewhere in Chile or Australia.
Right, but one of the world's fastest growing mines isn't underground at all. It's sitting in our homes, our offices, warehouses, and data centers. It's e-waste. Every phone, laptop, EV motor, wind turbine, hard drive, and appliance is effectively a future ore body.
And that's the key, concept, I think, in circularity, right? Which is not to have a linear supply chain where you extract, consume, and then dispose of. But once something is taken out of the environment, making sure that its useful life is continued as long as possible.
Yeah, and I would say that right now, as the opportunities are continuing to grow in the circular economy, the world is generating roughly 62 million tons of waste. That was in 2022, and that number has expected to exceed 80 million tons by 2030. Yet less than a quarter is actually formally recycled, which means billions of dollars of valuable materials are literally just being thrown away every year.
When people hear e-waste, they think copper wiring and maybe aluminum, but there's a lot more to it, isn't there?
Yeah, much more. Inside electronics, there's gold, there's silver, platinum, palladium, copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, and perhaps most importantly, rare elements. These materials are like neodymium, dyspros I don't even know how to pronounce dysprosium, terbium, and that makes incredibly powerful permanent magnets. Those magnets, those are the ones that are actually in EV motors or offshore wind turbines, robotics, industrial equipment, and even in your earbuds that you wear every day. And without them, the energy transition doesn't really happen.
And those are a lot of categories. I only see demand increasing more and more with a lot of the technology developments we're tracking on a day-to-day basis, which really brings us back to mining, right? Because demand for these materials is exploding and
Mhm.
supply isn't always keeping up.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, they're estimating that demand for critical minerals could actually increase several fold over the next 2 decades. Governments everywhere are worried about supply chains, not because the minerals are necessarily rare, but because production is incredibly concentrated, right? So right now, China is dominating the rare earth processing. The DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, they're producing most of the world's cobalt. Indonesia dominates with nickel. And then, so suddenly countries are asking, well, so how do we diversify?
And the answer might be at home, right? Our own trash.
In part, yes. A term that we don't always hear, but urban mining. And this doesn't replace traditional mining. There simply isn't enough material already in circulation to meet future demand, but it dramatically reduces the amount of new mining required. And unlike traditional mining, the ore has already been extracted. We already know exactly where it is. They're sitting in landfills, in warehouses, in recycling centers, and in forgotten drawers.
100%. And this is actually a space that we're working really closely in and particularly excited about because of that knowledge of where the kind of waste and the materials already sit. You skip the first process of mining, which is identifying the actual deposit within the earth. And so, you may have heard of urban mining. It's also referred to as landfill mining. Will oftentimes have a higher percentage and a kind of a richer ore than some natural mines. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, surprisingly, a ton of discarded smartphones can contain significantly more gold than a ton of mined gold ore. You're concentrating decades of manufacturing into one waste stream instead of moving mountains, literally. You're recovering materials that have already been refined once. That's why companies are investing heavily in advanced recycling technologies.
Well, if it's so obvious, why isn't everyone doing it by now?
That is the golden question. Because it's a collection, it's the hardest part. The technology exists, we know it exists. The economics increasingly work, but first you have to actually get the products back. Consumers keep old electronics, businesses store obsolete servers, devices get exported. Some end up in landfills, but others disappear into informal recycling markets. So collection, not processing, is often the biggest bottleneck.
Which brings us to where you've actually spent time and seen this issue firsthand in Ghana near your home.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Gambia where, I would see landfills continuing to grow, but specifically for e-waste, right outside of Accra is probably the largest e-waste cemetery in the world, which is Agbogbloshie. And this has become one of the world's most recognizable informal e-waste sites. People would dismantle electronics by hand. And when I say people, I mean not just adults, I mean children as well. So they're doing this all by hand, burn cables to recover copper, exposing themselves to toxic smoke, heavy metals and contaminated soil. And it's really highlighted both sides of the problem, right? On one side, there's this tremendous economic value that's locked inside these discarded electronics, but on the other, people are often the ones that are recovering the value under very dangerous conditions because they have very few alternatives.
So would you say it's better for these informal systems to disappear entirely?
Well, it's not that simple, right? There are millions of people globally that are earning income from these informal recycling processes. So the goal shouldn't be replacing them, but it should be more so integrating them into more safe collection systems. So, you know, imagine having formal purchasing programs, protective equipment, mechanized and automated dismantling, training, and facilities that can actually recover higher value materials without exposing workers, but having these workers actually operate the machine. So instead of losing livelihoods, you're actually upgrading them and keeping them in a much safer environment. And that's where some of the most exciting models are heading.
So this becomes more about recycling as an industrial policy, as a mechanism for economic development, and ultimately supply chain resilience and circularity, as opposed to disenfranchising, communities that rely on these landfills for a source of income.
Absolutely. And also, I would say national security. A lot of countries are realizing that waste isn't just waste anymore. It's actually a domestic resource. Every EV battery recycled, every hard drive recovered, every retired wind turbine processed means fewer imported raw materials. And that's a resilience story just as much as an environmental one.
It's almost changes how you think about cities.
Yeah, absolutely. Because cities then become above ground mines, literally. Every office building, every telecom network, every manufacturing plant, and the ever growing number of data centers, these are essentially storing tomorrow's critical materials. The challenge isn't whether the materials exist, it's building systems to recover them efficiently and safely.
And that seems to be the biggest misconception. People hear recycling and they think waste management, when really it incorporates advanced manufacturing and a lot of recent, developments in robotics and, computer vision, leveraging advanced AI models. And so it's less about just putting your waste out on the sidewalk, once a week, but really thinking more strategically about how those resources are incorporated back into, the manufacturing supply chain.
Yeah, exactly. This isn't yesterday's recycling industry. This is like, advanced automation, material science, as you mentioned, AI powered sorting, robotics. It's becoming one of tomorrow's resource industries for sure.
And honestly, if we can build an economy where yesterday's products become tomorrow's raw materials and, make that a virtuous cycle that only builds upon itself, like one of the interesting facts, right? I think that really struck me is that the same amount of copper being used, today in our economy is also sitting in landfills, right? So if we can find a way to capture the existing copper just sitting in landfills, we've automatically doubled our copper supply globally. We've also cleaned up landfills. We've reclaimed land, right? We have more, areas for public spaces, for public good or commercial use, housing, things of that nature. So it's one of those kind of co-benefits that just keeps going, not just increasing the supply of precious metals, but cleaning up the environment for both planetary and human health.
Yeah. And honestly, that's exactly the vision behind the circular economy, right? Waste stops being the end of the story. It becomes the beginning of the next supply chain.
And I think once everyone gets behind the vision. And when I say everyone, I mean more like corporate stakeholders, not individuals who oftentimes are beholden to the systems with which they live in. We get a lot of action and a lot of impact moving fast. And one of those corporate stakeholders that we love the work they're doing and want to highlight some of the incredible advancements they've made in this space in particular is Cyclic Materials. They're based in Canada. And Amira, I think you brought them up to me originally. What caught your attention?
Similar to the work that we're doing with Landfill OS, they're tackling one of the hardest parts of the circular economy, and that's recovering those rare earth elements. Most recycling focuses on the steel, the aluminum, or the copper because they're relatively straightforward, but rare earth magnets are much more difficult. And so, what Cyclic Materials has developed is a proprietary process, and they're able to recover these materials from end of life products, whether it's an electric motor, a hard disk, industrial equipment, and eventually wind turbine generators. And so, it's definitely a standout company, right? That's really focusing on how do we get these rare earth materials back into the supply chain.
Mm. So it sounds like, I mean, it's the step after the landfill mining, right? Once these
Mm-hmm.
items have been reclaimed from waste streams, how do we
Mm-hmm.
actually extract the useful materials like these rare earths from their original format? And, there, this is just a small subset of some of the applications of their technology. But, like, what's driving the demand for rare earths, right? We've talked about precious metals. Rare
Mm-hmm.
earths is related, but kind of a separate category that seems to be
Yeah.
particularly tied to many of the growing industries that we're seeing today.
Yeah, they are essential for electrification. EV motors, wind turbines, robotics, defense systems, consumer electronics. The demand is growing at an exponential rate, but supply remains concentrated. So, being able to recover those materials domestically creates a much more resilient supply chain.
And resiliency and circularity, I think, are inherently tied together when
Mhm.
you're not operating at the margins of efficiency, but actually can really make the most of what you already have, right? Like I've seen them achieve upwards of, I think, 90% recovery rate, and that's really significant when you're thinking about reclaimed materials.
Yeah, yeah, that is very significant. High recovery rate means materials stay in circulation and less need to be mined from virgin sources. So instead of treating old motors as waste, they're treating them as feedstock for the next generation of manufacturing. And that's the essence of a closed loop economy.
Cheers to that. Yeah, we need
Yeah.
we need more folks working in that direction. Really not thinking of it as a recycling company, but more so, just part of a broader supply chain, understanding where it came from and where it's going, as opposed to just kind of a one-off, recycle it once, but really thinking about it as a full, kind of recurring cycle, especially for those critical materials that go into everyday's products.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the mindset shift we'll see over the next decade. The companies that win, they're not just moving waste, they're producing strategic raw materials. And that's a very different business model. And one that's becoming increasingly important as countries compete to secure the resources they need for the energy transition.
And that's a thing we'll hold on to across all of our, kind of spotlights. And so we'll be highlighting one organization each week that's doing great work. And we'll be looking to bring on, members of their team for interviews going forward. So if you've got any companies you'd like us to highlight, feel free to send them our way. Same with news stories, exciting headlines, and anything in between. We're excited to hear from you, and we appreciate you sticking around for our first episode. More to come.
Thank you all. Tune in for next episode in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, y'all.